And today I am delighted that we have a team of speakers, Dr. Beth Orcutt and Dr. Diva Amon, and they're going to be telling us about deep sea mining negotiations and related topics. And with that, I'm just going to turn everything over to our speakers.
Thank you so much, Andy, for introducing our presentation today. So, hey, everybody, I'm Beth Orcutt. I'll be part of the dynamic duo giving the presentation today along with Diva. And yeah, COBRA has had previous webinars on this topic, and so we're hoping to build on that and tell you some new science that's come out since the last presentation, as well as updates on how policy negotiations are happening related to this topic. So I'll start us off, but I wanted to acknowledge that both Diva and I are ambassadors for the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, but that the information we're sharing today is our views. It's not representing the DOSI network. So Andy already gave this overview of kind of where we're at with this topic, and that thinking about this emergent potential industry in the deep sea that could impact the coastal ocean biosphere, and that COBRA is really interested in understanding these ecosystems and what those impacts might be. And so we had a webinar in March that featured Diva as well as Hannah Lilly, giving us a kind of a really wonderful overview. If you didn't have a chance to see that, that's on the COBRA YouTube page and the COBRA webpage. Just to highlight some of the big picture takeaways from some of that presentation, Diva presented about what some of those impacts might be, both on the sea floor as well as into the water column, and highlighting the spatial extent of which impacts might be occurring related to deep sea mining, both focusing on a region that gets a lot of attention called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, or CCZ, as you might hear in the presentation today, and thinking about those impacts both on the seafloor as well as in that water area. Again, this was in that webinar, so this is just a high-level reminder. Diva also emphasized in that presentation last time that there are really big knowledge gaps related to some of the key topics for considering deep sea mining impacts. This was in a paper that came out in 2012. So as Andy mentioned, one of the things that COBRA wants to do is try to help accelerate filling those knowledge gaps so that this industry can be as informed by science as possible. There was also another webinar that happened in April of 2023, just a few months ago, that was part of the DOOS annual meeting. The Deep Ocean Observing Strategy had their annual meeting. COBRA was part of that, and I gave a presentation in that annual meeting about what we know about recovery of deep sea coastal ecosystems to impacts. And so I highlighted a few studies that have done work thinking about trawling impacts. I presented some of that. Again, that's available on the COBRA YouTube page, as well as I think DOOS's YouTube, if you want to refresh your memory or see what those presentations were about. So in our presentation today, we're not going to go a lot into that prior work. We really want to focus on some of the new stuff. I put this slide in there just because I'm a microbiologist. I really care about impacts to microbes. This is one of the things I highlighted in April as an area that we need to know more about what these impacts are. So what's happened since March? What we want to talk about in our presentation today is highlighting some new science that's been published in the last few months and how that informs thinking about deep sea mining. We'll give an overview of also some recent policy briefs that have been put forward to try to synthesize things for policymakers, as well as give you an update on some of those recent policy developments related to negotiations for potential deep sea mining in international waters. So I'll start us off with one of the science highlights, and then I will turn it over to Diva. So one of the recent papers we wanted to draw your attention to was this paper that came out in June led by Travis Washburn and his colleagues, looking at what are impacts of test mining of seafloor massive sulfides. And this was done, a study that was done on an inactive sulfide structure in a caldera in the Okinawa Trough, where kind of test mining was done in the area highlighted by a cross on that far right-hand image, and then monitoring was done at different sites in relation to that test mining site. So what was the study? In case you haven't had a chance to look at this, in 2017, test mining was done, a relatively short-term test mining, where an excavator removed part of the seafloor from about 26 square meters, about a 6-hour test. And worth noting that this inactive sulfide structure is only about 200 meters away from a known active venting system. So that's something important to keep in mind when we think about these seafloor massive sulfides. And then the team monitored sediment chemistry as well as fauna at sites that ranged in distance between 15 and 55 meters away, both starting before the test and then following on after that test was done for up to 3 years. And I think it's important to note that not all stations were sampled every single time. That's something we need to keep in mind when we interpret this kind of work. But what were some of the major findings from that study? So elevated metals were found in some of those sediments that were downstream of where the mining impact occurred, the test mining impact. At some of the sites that were only moderately impacted at the beginning, the data suggests that pre-disturbance levels of those metals recovered at about 1 year. And the thought is that's related to oxidation of those metals in that sediment. But some of the sites that were more heavily impacted by deposition of that seafloor massive sulfide sediment plume still had elevated metal concentrations, even up to 3 years after the disturbance. So that's an important finding. The team also looked at the abundance of fauna in these sediments, from the nanofauna level up to the macrofauna level. And the study suggests that mining impacts for nanofauna and some myofauna may return to kind of the pre-test levels of impact or after impact. But the community structure may still show change after that time period. In contrast to that, the larger animals, macrofauna, still appear to be depressed, and not just at the sites that were impacted up to 3 years later. And so that suggests that when we think about monitoring of impacts, thinking about the different types of biology, the different categories of the community and how they're impacted, it's not one size fits all. So I'm going to turn it over to Diva now to tell us about some of the other studies.
Thanks, Beth, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So just to take over from Beth and continue on with the science, so one of the other big papers that came out just this July was an enormous study that was led by Eric Simon Yedo at National Oceanography Centre in the UK. And what he did was essentially looked at megafauna across the Clarion-Clipperton zone, and he synthesized several different, I think at least 15 different megafaunal data sets from different contract areas. And I can tell you that was an enormous undertaking given the differences in the sampling differences. But he undertook this process and as a result was able to do the first regional analysis for the Clarion-Clipperton zone from a megafaunal perspective. And you can see the sites there in that map. And so next slide, please, Beth. And so what the study found, and there's a few major things, is that firstly is that there are two pronounced biogeographic provinces in the abyssal CCZ, and those seem to be largely following depth. So first there is a deeper one, and then there's a shallower one. And each of those have very different fauna living in them. And because of that difference in fauna, can we flip back to the other slide, Beth, for a second? So here you can see the actual abundances in animals in the graph to the right, and you can see how some of the groups change with depth. So the deeper sites, which are the red, tend to basically have animals that do not necessarily have calcium within them, and those on the so things like softer animals, soft body animals like holothurians and sea pens and others, and then those on the right, so shallower, are animals that tend to have very different castrates. So if we could go back, please, Beth, sorry. Yes. So we have attributed a lot of these differences in these biogeographic provinces to ultimately the calcium carbonate saturation boundaries, or CCD, calcium carbonate compensation depth. And essentially it's meant that taxa that are dependent on these calcium carbonate structures, such as malas, tend to disappear in deeper provinces where they are below that CCD. And also they found that as a result of geochemical and climate forcing on distributions on abyssal populations over these very large spatial scales, it really does suggest that, and this is perhaps the biggest finding as a result of this, this biological finding, is that there are real challenges in governance in this area and what is currently the governance mechanism in place. And so those of you who follow the Clarion-Clipperton zone, you'll know that there are areas of particular environmental interest, which are kind of akin to marine protected areas, and they're dotted around the outside of the CCZ contract areas. And this has shown, while that process to define those areas was done in, I think, 2011, and then again revised in 2020, in a workshop that both Beth and I attended, it's actually shown that really, while it did use the best available science at the time, science is consistently moving, and there does need to be reviews consistently given the new information. As it stands, that spatial management mechanism does not take into consideration any of this, and therefore is not necessarily adequate in many ways. So a lot to consider there. Next slide, please, Beth. So another big study that came out again in July. July was a pretty hot month for deep sea mining papers. Is one again by Travis Washburn and others, and this one is again about a mining test, and basically showed that essentially provided evidence of ecological impacts beyond the direct footprint of mining and beyond the deposition area of mining. So this is not something that's necessarily been shown before. And so what they found is that responses really did vary in fauna across community components. So for instance, densities of sessile animals they were similar between deposition and adjacent areas throughout the study, but mobile epifauna were less abundant in the deposition area following disturbance, and actually highly mobile swimmers also showed reduced densities after the test, both in the deposition area and in the adjacent areas. So essentially, fish can potentially avoid areas even outside the area of the plume, and that's possibly owing, they attributed it to the creation of suboptimal feeding patches. So really that there are knock-on effects potentially within the community beyond the actual footprint of the direct footprint of mining, as well as the plume impact zone of mining. Next slide, please, Beth. Thank you. And so these results really are stressing that there is a need when considering mining tests and potentially commercial mining, that monitoring does need to include highly mobile taxa to really assess the full extent of disturbance and the magnitude of disturbance. And they also suggest that sufficiently large and distant and representative control areas are essential to assessing impact and ensuring that, yes, essentially to assessing impact. And so within the context of the ISA, there are impact reference zones, IRZs, and preservation reference zones, so PRZs. And there are now concerns that PRZs, well, even greater concerns now that PRZs do need to be a sufficient distance away, be much beyond just the plume impact zone, to be able to adequately act as really control sites to measure impact. I know that was already a concern given noise potential impacts, but this adds evidence to the fact that, again, these sites need to be chosen very carefully. Next slide, please, Beth. So there's another study that came out that I led. And so this came out again in July. And where this came from is essentially there was a study that came out in 2021 by Johan Bell and others within the Pacific community that essentially showed that with climate change and changing conditions in the ocean as a result of climate change, tuna are going to be migrating out of Pacific country EEZs and into areas beyond national jurisdiction and essentially moving in a eastward direction in the Pacific. And so that when we saw that study, that really twigged some interest, given that there is the CCZ is in the Eastern Pacific, and we wanted to see what that overlap might look like. And so what our study found using climate modeling in 2 different climate scenarios, RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5, for 3 different species of tuna, the 3 most valuable species of tuna in the Pacific, we found that there is going to be increasing overlap between Pacific tuna fisheries and the potentially emerging deep sea mining industry in the Clarion-Clipperton zone with changing environmental conditions as a result of climate change. And so on this figure, where you can see this shows the Clarion-Clipperton zone, and those percentages to the right of each of the Clarion-Clipperton zone areas are the increase in biomass that is expected for each of the different RCP scenarios. So it really does vary between about a 10% increase in biomass all the way up to like a 30% increase in biomass, which is pretty significant. If we can move on, please, Beth. And so in that paper, while discussing these we discussed the potential implications of this increasing conflict. And we also then suggest some recommendations as to how this area of the Pacific could be more holistically managed between, for instance, consideration of the 2 RFMOs that the CCZ falls under, as well as the ISA, as well as, for instance, new and relevant tools like what is going to emerge from the BBNJ negotiations in that treaty. And alongside this paper, coinciding really with it, there was a statement that emerged from major seafood industry players, including the Global Tuna Alliance, whose 48 industry partners account for 32% of global tuna trade, as well as many more. There was a statement basically that came out where these industry players are calling for a pause for the transition of exploration of mining to exploitation. Just because of the risks involved, and really asking for more time to be given to understand what the potential impacts might be to tuna and how severe they might be. Thanks, Beth. Next slide. So I think the last study I'm going to cover before I hand over to Beth, and I'm just going to do this very briefly, is a study by Jessica Volz and others from JPI Oceans Mining Impact. And essentially they found that polymetallic nodules, I think it was known that the polymetallic nodules were very minimally radioactive. Definitely on cruises I've been on, we've had a Geiger counter with us. But they studied that in depth and were able to really take a very in-depth look at the alpha radiation that emanates from polymetallic nodules, and then also looked at the potential health risks from deep sea mining and essentially flagged that there is something that needs to be considered there if this industry does move forward, and the management of that industry to ensure the safety of people who may be interacting with these nodules, as well as potentially things like seafood stocks and other bits. Thanks, Beth. Next slide.
Thanks, Diva. So I'll pick up here again. Another report that came out in June that we wanted to highlight for the audience today is a report that came out from the European Academy's Science Advisory Council. So this is, in a way, think of it as countries in Europe that have their own scientific advisory boards. There's a European group that kind of brings those expertises together as a council. And they issued a report in June, Deep Sea Mining, Assessing Evidence on Future Needs and Environmental Impacts, and kind of looking at deep sea mining from both the perspective of the potential motivation for deep sea mining for getting critical minerals, as well as environmental impacts. And one of the things I wanted to highlight there was a figure that was in that report, emphasizing that some of the metals that are primarily the target for deep sea mining currently from nodule regions are things like nickel, cobalt, and some others are mainly categorized as relatively low supply risk in the assessment that was done. And you can see how those move into different commodities and different sectors. But this is one of the things that was emphasized in this report, and putting together kind of a summary statement that posits that the arguments that are often made framing deep sea mining as an essential part of the energy transition away from fossil fuels maybe is not as valid as is commonly discussed. The report suggests that those claims are often misleading, and that there might be other strategies for getting those metals, which I'll talk about in a moment. And the report also notes that if you were to compare terrestrial mining to mining in the deep sea, remediation strategies that are viable for terrestrial mining, like mitigating harm or trying to remediate harm, they are not necessarily applicable in the deep sea. And so that also needs to be part of the balance in weighing things. This Academy's report also had a very nice figure in the last 2 pages of it that I thought captured a lot of the recent scientific statements that have come out, emphasizing some of the key issues related to deep sea mining. So again, one of the first parts of this report was challenging some of the assumptions about whether or not metals are needed and in what quantities and whether they need to come from the deep sea. And one of their first summary statements here is that a large fraction of Europe's clean energy metal needs could actually come from recycling metals and reevaluating our supply chain and how we move metals around in it. Oops. Again, emphasizing that some of the metals that are currently targeted for a lot of that are getting the most attention could be categorized as a low supply risk. And so is it worth going into the deep sea to get them for that? And again, emphasizing that if you make those assumptions about recycling and needs, that there's potentially enough reserves on land to not need to go in the deep sea for these metals. Another part of this summary slide that they had, again, emphasizing that the footprint of mining on the deep sea is much larger than what the footprint would be needed for similar supplies coming from terrestrial-based sources. Focusing then on the deep sea aspects, emphasizing that the extraction process really does cause very challenging conditions for a very large fraction of the animal community, many of which require those hard substrates to attach to and create habitat for other organisms. And then finally, the summary slide or summary graphic from that report, emphasize really the spatial and volumetric scale of the potential impacts of mining and what that kind of damage footprint might look like. So some of the other kind of high-level statements that came out of this Scientific Academy report is that because there's a lack of consensus on what constitutes serious harm to these deep sea environments because of those knowledge gaps that we've emphasized, and that there's not really good thresholds for knowing if you've hit those harm limits, that it's going to be very difficult for this industry to effectively protect the marine environment. And essentially the outcome of this council report was advocacy for a moratorium until these things can be better understood. And I think here I am transitioning back over to Diva to talk about some of the recent policy briefs that have come out.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. And so before I move into the policy briefs, just to say that that was not an exhaustive list of all the science that has come out. Like, I'm sure many of you are aware of other papers related to deep sea mining in the deep ocean that have come out in that time. There is this growing body of knowledge, and these papers are coming out fast and furiously. So apologies if we didn't mention papers relevant to you, etc. But there's a lot more information out there. So moving into policy briefs, thank you. So something that many of us in the community are doing is essentially taking science and translating it into a product that is going to be more easily assimilated by the policy community and broader stakeholder groups. And so there have been the two main bodies that do that in the deep sea mining lens, or two of the bodies, I should say, that do that through a deep sea mining lens, is the Pew Charitable Trust and their CODE project, as well as the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative. So I'm going to mention a few of those products that have come out from both those groups. So the first is this 8th report of the CODE project. The CODE project is a Pew-funded group of experts. I think it's close to 20 experts from around the world, both science and policy experts, who essentially assess various issues related to deep seabed mining and or the ISA. So on this particular occasion, this came out in April this year, they chose to look at how the scientific expertise at the ISA or engaging with the ISA could potentially be enhanced. So next slide, please, Beth. And so in that respect, the main science body within the ISA is the Legal and Technical Commission, or LTC. They're the primary technical and scientific advisory body to the Council, which is the decision-making body of the ISA. And some of their core functions include reviewing applications for plans of work for exploration and future exploitation activities, reviewing environmental impact assessments, the supervision of exploration or mining activities, including reviewing annual reports that ISA contractors are obligated to submit every year. And I'll remind you, there are 31 contracts, and these, having compiled some of these reports, they are mammoth documents, several hundred pages. Also participate in the development of regional environmental management plans, as well as the assessment of environmental implications of activities in the area, and contribute to the formulation, development, and review of rules, regulations, and procedures. So there is a lot on the plate of these experts. And as a result of this huge workload that they have, the LTC and the growing workload, it was decided by the council and others that the LTC should be expanded. It used to be 30-ish, I want to say, odd members, and now it's moved up into 41 members as of the cycle that has started this year. The LTC usually meets before each of the February and the July council sessions, March or July council sessions. And anybody who's been elected to the LTC from a range of different countries, they sit on the LTC for a period of 5 years with the possibility of extension of another period of 5 years. It should be emphasized that really these members are not ISA staff, and they are instead serving on a volunteer basis and in their personal capacity. It is a huge undertaking, and anyone who's participating in it should really be commended. Next slide, please. So some of the findings of this report is ultimately, given the importance of the LTC and the fact that the ISA needs to be seeking best available scientific evidence base, that does require a very broad range of scientific expertise and is critical to ISA decision making. And so as a result, as we mentioned, the ISA did opt to grow the number of experts on the LTC. And however, it's seen by many that that's still inadequate. And as a result, it is crucial or suggested that for the credibility that the LTC does continue to seek and incorporate the expertise of best available scientific information to inform its decision making. And so next slide, please, Beth. And so a few of the recommendations is that, or findings before we get to the recommendations, is that the LTC does have and I'll quote here, an overwhelming workload and does not possess adequate environmental expertise. Currently on the LTC, there are a number of scientific experts, including biological experts. There are quite a few geologists. There are quite a few policy or experts or lawyers. And there's also some contractors as well. and some of those overlap, but it was deemed by the code project that there is just not enough expertise needed for the tasks at hand. And while these issues regarding the LTC's composition and working methods can be improved, it's still really difficult to conceive of any structure that will allow this, will essentially work through a limited membership voluntary body with sufficient expertise to enable them to do the task of making evidence-based recommendations for this emerging industry in a poorly understood environment, such as the deep sea. So some pretty significant shortcomings were found in the LTC, even given its expansion. Next slide, please, Beth. So just to summarize some more of the findings, so the challenges, the workload, the transparency. So many of you may know that the LTC operates closed meetings, and there have been calls from civil society and a lot of other organizations that those meetings should be open, given that they are discussing the common heritage of humankind, but there are very real concerns about the transparency of decision making there. And there's also very real concerns, as I alluded to, about impartiality and objectivity, given that there are a number of contractors who sit on the LTC. So it's essentially like the fox guarding the chicken, kind of. So some recommendations from the code project to improve how the ISA accesses scientific information is to increase the independence of the LTC body, to increase the knowledge that they have access to or present, to diversify who is present on that LTC, as well as who they seek external expertise from, to add more legitimacy to their work, and essentially to really think very critically about their workload. That is both in terms of attending meetings. LTC currently meets for 3 weeks every year in Jamaica, but also to how much they have to accomplish within that time. It really is a lot. And then there was also a suggestion about really making adequate and predictable funding available to support these individuals. As we said, it's often done on a voluntary basis and in personal capacity. And that means that likely many are excluded who maybe want to participate and provide great expertise, but they cannot. Next slide, please, Beth. So I encourage you to read that report if you haven't, and many of the code project reports, many of them are still extremely relevant and feature a lot of issues that are still outstanding. So then also the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, ahead of every ISA session or every part of the ISA sessions, they usually produce new information sheets, what we used to be called policy briefs. And so on this particular occasion, ahead of the ISA July session, 3 information sheets were created. And it was essentially one for each of the 3 deep sea ecosystems where mining may take place in the future. So there was one for seamounts, like you're seeing here, one for abyssal plains with nodules, like the CCZ, and one for hydrothermal vents. And what the topic was of these information sheets on these particular occasions was really looking at the ecosystem services provided by each of these deep sea ecosystems, because ultimately that is a question that policymakers often ask is that, how ultimately does this relate to us? What are the risks for mining, and how can they potentially impact how we benefit from the deep sea? And so DOSI thought this was an appropriate topic to write one on, and there are 3 policy briefs about that with some beautiful figures included. So if you're ever doing presentations on such, it's a great place to get information from. Thanks, Beth. Next slide. And so am I handing over to you now, or am I continuing?
You're going to do the overview.
All right. Thank you. Okay. So, so there's a lot that's happened scientifically. There's a lot that's happened in translating that science into more easily assimilated products. And then now let's move on to what actually happened at the most recent July session of the ISA. So many of you may know that, am I supposed to go? Anyway, okay, so many of you may know that there was a session, part of a session in March and part of a session in July, and there will be a 3rd session in November this year. And what happened at both of them and has continued to happen is that there was no adoption or agreement of the mining code. So the exploitation regulations and all of the accessory documents that go with it. And as many of you may know, there was also the 2-year rule that was triggered by Nauru in July 2021. So that rule essentially meant that the ISA, or how it was interpreted at the time, was that the ISA had 2 years in which to close that regulation loophole and essentially adopt and agree the mining code. Otherwise, Nauru had rights to submit an application for exploitation, even in the absence of rules and regulations and procedures. So that period obviously expired this July. So there were a lot of questions around what that would mean for these negotiations, what that would mean for the mining industry. And as after the March and July sessions, especially the July one, essentially that legal loophole has not been closed, though there was a lot of discussion around it. And so it means that applications for exploitation can still be submitted, even in the absence of regulations. However, in the March session, and again in the July session, there was a commitment on multiple occasions from states to not allow any exploitation to move forward without rules, regulations, and procedures in place. So sure, countries / companies are still invited to, they're not invited, sorry, they are still able to apply. However, it is highly likely, given the statements made within the negotiations, that those applications, if it were to happen, would be denied at this stage. There was also a commitment to, well, I'll get onto that in a second. So something else that happened at both sessions is that there has been a continuing and accelerating resistance by states in the room to the exploitation beginning. And that was in the form of either a moratorium or pause or ban being called for by several states in the room. And so as of this July session, there were 5 more countries that came forward, as you can see in the little figure in the bottom: Ireland, Canada, Brazil, Finland, and Portugal. Some of who called for a pause, some of who called for a moratorium, many are treating it as the same thing. But essentially all of them, all of the 21 states that have now done so have done so using the reasoning that we just don't know enough to move ahead with exploitation, and really citing those significant scientific knowledge gaps as the main issue. And ultimately that a moratorium and pause would allow for time for more scientific understanding to be gathered. There was also, for the first time, a lot of that was just discussed was in the council session, which happens in March and July. And then in July, there's also an assembly session. So the assembly is essentially the supreme body of the ISA, and it includes all states that have ratified UNCLOS. And it was for the first time, the assembly was, an agenda item was proposed for the assembly on the protection of the marine environment and a potential moratorium. And that was done by, gosh, I don't want to get it wrong, but Vanuatu, Costa Rica, France, and I want to say maybe Chile, or Palau, one of them. But and that was proposed as an agenda item. And during the week-long assembly meeting, there were several countries, namely the UK, Norway, Nauru, Mexico, and China, who blocked that conversation from being added to the formal agenda. And it meant that the entire week proceeded without a formal agenda having been adopted. So it got to Friday evening, the 11th hour, and it meant that because there had been no formal agenda adopted, all of the decisions that had been made during that week were essentially invalid as a result of this agenda not having been adopted. And so at the 11th hour, there was a compromise between, it ended up being China mainly blocking the discussion as the week went on. And at the 11th hour, there was an agreement between China and other states, mostly Costa Rica and Chile and Brazil, to push this conversation about the protection of the marine environment and the potential moratorium to the July 2024 assembly session. So it remains to be seen what will happen there. But it certainly was a very tedious and intense 3 weeks of negotiations in July and 2 weeks of negotiations in March. And there was consistent working through of the mining code, but it is still very, very far away from being completed. However, next slide, please, Beth. However, what's next? So despite the fact that it depends who you speak to, but there are very differing opinions on when that potential mining code might be completed and adopted. And so what happened was there was discussion on whether there could be a commitment to finishing the mining code by next year. And states in the room were adamant that there should be no formal commitment. So instead, there is just the decision from the council says that there is best intent to finish the mining code by the end of 2024. However, that is not a solid commitment. And I think that's because many in the room recognize that there is still a very long way to go on those rules, regulations, and procedures. So there is going to be a 10-day session in November this year. There's also going to be the normal sessions in March and July next year, as well as potentially a November session next year as well. So there really has not been and will not be a let up on that really intense timetable for trying to get the negotiations, the mining code adopted. And I think many states are pretty fatigued by what has happened already. There's also this commitment to continue to deal with the 2-year loophole at the next negotiation. As I said, the discussion of the moratorium / protection of the marine environment has been deferred to the Assembly in 2024. And here in this picture, you can see some of the sort of countries that have really championed the environment. And then there's going to be a lot of intercessional work. So something that has really accelerated is that a lot of the work is not being done just at these sessions. It's being done intercessionally. And as to facilitate that, there have been a number of working groups. Probably more than 10 at this point. There's a lot of working groups on many different subject areas, from underwater cultural heritage to environmental thresholds to inspection and compliance mechanisms, enforcement mechanisms, lots of different topics. And those are meant to carry on their work intercessionally so that more progress can be made more quickly. Just a flag at the bottom that Nauru, when they triggered the 2-year rule, they are the sponsoring state of the metals company. And there's been a lot of speculation that it was whatever, we'll forget the speculation. But the point is that their stock price, they listed publicly on the NASDAQ stock exchange. And their stock price has been certainly something to observe. You'll see that from, I think, before September 2022, when they listed, September 2021, when they listed, they started at a share price of about $12. And it's been really interesting to watch, especially with the timeline of the negotiations, how that stock has changed. And so we've seen a pretty steady decline. However, there was, ahead of the July session, there was a lot of thought that by many, and I think thanks to misinformation from the metals company itself to keep their stock price high, that there could be adoption of the mining code in the July session. And so actually in the July session, on this diagram at the bottom here, you can see there's like a peak just at the end of the graph. And that is actually from sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like not essentially a lot of their shareholders were very hopeful that the mining code would be adopted and that would send the share price higher. So you can see the share price started to climb. And then when it became clear that that actually would not be the case, their share price has now dropped as well. So it's just a really interesting case study on how an international negotiation process is potentially impacting the share price of one of these deep sea mining companies. Thanks, Beth. Next slide.
Yeah, so I think this is where I jump in to close this out. Diva mentioned that there is a lot of intercessional work happening, and something I wanted to bring to the attention of this community, many of whom are scientists joining us, is that there is a call for nominations for experts to help the Legal and Technical Commission in an intercessional expert group to evaluate the landscape of knowledge to help develop binding environmental threshold values related to toxicity in the environment, turbidity and kind of suspension of sediments, and noise and light pollution as three very specific things to look at setting binding thresholds for. I would hope that scientists all over the world want to consider being part of that. As Diva said, already one of the challenges of the LTC is that this is all voluntary at the moment, but we need experts to participate and bring that scientific knowledge. If you go on the ISA webpage, or if you go to the DOCI Minerals Working Group, you can learn more about what the call is for experts, what the terms of reference are. It includes, for instance, the schedule off to the right of how often this group is going to try to meet to come up with these thresholds within essentially a year. And as you know, as we've said, there's a lot of knowledge gaps. So this is going to be an interesting year to follow this work. So if you feel like you might have competence relative to what knowing about the deep sea, what might cause harm, what we know about harm, what we know about thresholds and monitoring, please reach out either to a country delegation if you're part of a country that's at the ISA, or you can reach out to the DOCI Minerals Working Group and learn more about that. Those nominations are due September 15th. So maybe if you're in the Northern Hemisphere on your summer vacation, maybe think about whether you want to do this. With that, I want to thank Diva for joining me and giving this presentation. I also want to thank all of the other ambassadors for the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative who have volunteered their time to go to these meetings in Kingston and try to raise awareness about the science behind potential deep sea mining, to make sure that that's part of the conversation. So with that, thank you so much for being here with us, and we'll take questions as we can.
Great, thank you.